Bloodborne has been hiding things from you for over a decade, things so deeply buried in item descriptions, enemy placements, and environmental details that most players walked right past them without ever knowing what they had stumbled into. This video was put together because I kept noticing how scattered and fragmented most discussions of Bloodborne's darker lore really are. People talk about the bosses, the trick weapons, the chalice dungeons, but nobody sits down and really connects the pieces that are genuinely unsettling. Not the surface level horror, but the stuff underneath it, the body horror, with actual implications. The experiments that suggest something far worse than what we see. So I made this video to bring those threads together in one place. One choice I made when assembling this was to lean into implications rather than certainties. Bloodborne's lore rarely gives you a clean answer, and I think that ambiguity is actually part of what makes it so disturbing. Where the game suggests something horrible, I followed that suggestion. Where it pointed towards something worse, I went there. I left out some of the more hotly debated interpretations where there wasn't enough evidence to make a compelling case. And I reordered some topics thematically rather than by in-game progression, because the horror makes more sense when you build it piece by piece. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The Medical Ward and What the Doctors Were Really Doing. The first place most hunters ever see in Bloodborne is the Osefka's clinic, and it is easy to walk through it early on and think of it as just an abandoned hospital. The beds are empty, the floors are stained. There are a handful of enemies and some items to grab, and then you move on. But if you come back later, or if you pay attention to what the game is actually telling you, the clinic becomes one of the most deeply uncomfortable places in the entire game. Osefka herself is presented to you very early as a voice behind a locked door. She sounds kind. She sounds concerned. She tells you not to worry, that she will be there for you, that if you send survivors her way, she will give them treatment. It sounds like a lifeline. In a game where almost everyone you meet either attacks you or descends into madness, having someone stable and calm on the other end of a door feels genuinely reassuring. The problem is that Osefka is not who she sounds like. The woman talking to you from behind that door is an imposter, and the real Osefka has already been experimented on by the time you are even capable of reaching her. The real Osefka ends up as a crawling, mutated creature in the back of her own clinic, having been subjected to experiments by the woman impersonating her, and there is a strong suggestion in the environmental layout that she was fully conscious through at least some of that process. The imposter Josefika is a choir member, one of the upper echelons of the healing church, and she has been using the clinic as a private lab. This is not a case of an evil organization doing something in secret from a good one. The healing church itself is the organization behind Yharnam's entire transformation, and the imposter's work at the clinic is a continuation of that work, just on a smaller and more intimate scale. Every survivor you send to Osefka's clinic gets turned into a celestial emissary. That is not speculation. If you send enough people there and then enter through the back, you will find them in the clinic in their new, transformed state. The game never announces this. There is no cutscene. You just find them like that, wandering the halls of the place they were told was safety. The transformation into a celestial emissary is not a kind one. These beings are small, soft-bodied creatures that look almost embryonic, caught somewhere between human and something else entirely. The item descriptions for the blood of Ariana and the blood of Adela, two of the 3 survivors you can send to the clinic, give you little hints about who they were before. Ariana is a woman of the night who speaks with a kind of weary dignity. Adela is a nun who is quietly terrified. Both of them trusted you. What the imposter Josefka was doing, in the most clinical terms the game offers, was administering transfusions that accelerated a process the healing church had been studying for years. The goal, or at least one of the goals, seems to have been ascension. The idea that humanity could be pushed through blood transfusion into something higher, something closer to the Great Ones. But the way it happens in practice is nothing like the elevated concept. The patients writhe, they lose their shape, They lose whatever internal coherence made them people. And then they become something that wanders aimlessly and dies when hit hard enough. The gap between the aspiration and the reality of what the church was doing is one of the most quietly devastating things in Bloodborne. And the clinic is where you can see it most directly. What makes it worse is that the healing church was not doing this in ignorance. They knew what blood administration did to people in the long run. The discovery of the old blood, the substance at the heart of Yharnam's medical miracle, was made in the Pthumerian ruins beneath the city. Those ruins are filled with the evidence of what the Pthumerians became after generations of contact with the Great Ones and their blood, and the Healing Church founders had access to that evidence. Lawrence, the founder of the Healing Church, was a student of Gurman and went on to build an institution around the power of the old blood. The game suggests, through a combination of item descriptions and boss lore, that Lawrence knew the risks. Not just suspected, knew. His skull, which you find in the cathedral ward, and which serves as an item that unlocks a memory sequence, radiates heat. The description tells you that Lawrence used to warn people of the dangers of the old blood, even as he promoted its use. That detail sits in the lore like a splinter. He warned people. He kept warning them. And then he built a church on top of the very thing he warned people about, and that church eventually transformed an entire city. The clinic, in this reading, is not an anomaly. It is a microcosm. One person with the church's tools and the church's methods, doing exactly what the church does, just to people with names and faces you actually know. It strips away the scale and makes it personal, which is exactly why it is one of the most disturbing parts of the early game, when you understand it. The imposter Iosefka also appears as a boss if you visit the clinic at the right point in the game's progression. She has administered one of the very same transfusions to herself, partially transforming herself in pursuit of what the church would call insight. When you fight her, she is not a monster in the traditional sense. She moves wrong, she speaks in fragmented ways, and the fight ends badly for her. The lore around her final state suggests she was trying to achieve something and nearly did. There is a baby in this story, and that detail tends to stay with people. If Ariana is among the survivors you send to the clinic, she eventually gives birth to a stillborn Great One infant. The delivery happens quietly, off-screen, but Ariana survives it in a devastated state. This child, this tiny dead thing that lands near her in the cathedral ward, is the result of her partial transformation. Something about the blood ministration made her carry it. The game does not explain this in detail. It just shows you the aftermath. The celestial emissary boss that you fight later in the cathedral ward has a large version among the smaller ones. It is exactly what you would expect if the process was pushed further in a single subject. The boss fight itself is oddly anticlimactic for what it represents, which might be intentional. By the time you get there, the horror has already been laid out. The fight is just confirmation. What the clinic collectively represents is the Healing Church's philosophy made literal. The Church believed that proximity to the Great Ones, through their blood and their knowledge, was inherently elevating. They called it gaining insight. They built rituals around it. They made it sound like spiritual progress. But the clinic shows you what insight actually looks like when it is administered forcibly and repeatedly to unwilling or uninformed subjects. It looks like empty beds and crawling things. The nurses in the clinic, those long-armed, swaying figures, were once medical staff. The game does not give them much backstory beyond that, but their design tells you something. They are not the raving beasts you encounter in the streets. They are something slower and more deliberate, something that retained just enough of their former function to make them feel familiar in the worst possible way. There is something about the way they move that reads as procedural, as if they are still doing the work they were trained for. The operating theatre at the back of the clinic has a table with straps. Item placements in Soul-style games are rarely accidental, and the straps are not decorative. Someone was restrained in that room. And the spatial relationship between a table and the items you find nearby tells a story without using words. The layout of the room implies a sequence of events that the game trusts you to reconstruct on your own. The blood in Bloodborne is never just blood. It carries memory. It carries transformation. It carries the touch of things that operated on a scale larger than human comprehension. The old blood, in particular, seems to accelerate something that was already latent, pushing people toward whatever their exposure to the Great Ones had primed them for. For most Yharnamites, that meant the beast plague. For the clinic's subjects, it meant something more specific. The distinction between beast transformation and celestial emissary transformation seems to hinge on the source of the blood and the method of administration. Regular blood ministration from the healing church, the kind every citizen of Yharnam receives, nudges people toward the beast side of the spectrum. The more refined transfusions used in the clinic, based on blood more directly connected to the cosmic side of the Great One's influence, push people toward the otherworldly end. There is a whole theology buried in that distinction, and the healing church had mapped at least some of it out. The choir, the upper tier of the church, explicitly worked toward contact with the Great Ones. The lower tiers dealt with healing and the beast plague, and the hunters who managed the fallout. The clinic was effectively a choir operation, disguised within the infrastructure of the lower church. The use of a fake identity is telling. The imposter did not take over the clinic openly. She used Yosefka's name, Yosefka's voice, Yosefka's position. Why? The most straightforward reading is that she needed the clinic to appear functional for as long as possible, that the survivors being sent there were a resource, and that resource required cooperation. A locked door and a kind voice were enough to keep people sending her subjects voluntarily. That mechanism, the voluntary cooperation of the victims enabled by a deception, is one of the recurring structures in Bloodborne's horror. People trust the church, they trust the clinics, they trust the hunters, and the system takes that trust and converts it into raw material. The clinic is a very small-scale version of a process that happened across the entire city of Yharnam over many years. The workshop underneath the clinic, partially visible and partially blocked, connects to the healing church's broader research apparatus. The item you find in the clinic that relates to Lawrence suggests a direct line between the clinic's work and the foundational research that built the church. This was not a rogue operation. It was continuous with everything else. The blood dregs, collected from the clinic, described in their item text as the remnants of failed ascension, end up in the hands of Adeline, a patient in the research hall higher up in the same complex of buildings. Adeline's story is one of the most explicit examples of the church's treatment of its human subjects, and it connects back to the clinic through those blood dregs as a kind of thematic thread. The research hall is where the church conducted more advanced experimentation on patients who were kept there in varying states of awareness. Some of them were lobotomized. Some of them were given so much refined blood that their heads began to transform. The liquid that spills from their changed skulls is a byproduct of the same process that the clinic was starting, just taken further. Adeline is the endpoint of that process for one particular subject, and she asks you for more brain fluid with a clarity and specificity that suggests she understands exactly what is happening to her. Connecting the clinic to the research hall completes a picture of what the healing church's medical apparatus was actually for. The clinic was intake, the research hall was deeper processing, and above the research hall was the lighthouse hut and the astral clock tower, which represents the final destination of subjects who made it through. The architecture itself is a pipeline for human experimentation, and the clinic is the friendly-sounding front door. The friendly-sounding front door with the kind voice behind it, and the locked entrance that kept survivors feeling safe rather than imprisoned. That detail never gets less disturbing the more you think about it. What the game never tells you directly, but strongly implies through the arrangement of its details, is that the healing church maintained this system because it worked. Not for the subjects, for the church. The celestial emissaries are evidence of successful transformation, however awful that transformation was for the people involved. The research moved forward. The insight accumulated. The ascension protocols were refined over multiple iterations. The clinic is the place where Bloodborne shows you that horror and progress can be the same thing, when the people doing the progressing have decided that the people being processed are acceptable losses. And it does this without a monologue, without a villain speech, just with empty beds and wrong-moving nurses, and a voice behind a door that sounds so genuinely concerned about your well-being. The transformation of the survivors is not reversible. The game gives you no mechanism to undo it, no way to send them somewhere safer. Once they go through that door, they are gone. This is unusual for Souls games, which often give you options, or at least ambiguity, about the outcomes of your choices. Bloodborne is specific here. There is a door, survivors go through it. What happens on the other side is what the clinic shows you when you enter from the back. The imposter Yoeska drops a third of the umbilical cord when defeated, and the umbilical cord items are connected to the game's true ending, the one where the hunter transcends the dream. The fact that one of the 4 items you need for that ending comes from a woman who spent the night turning people into cosmic embryos is exactly the kind of layered, dark humor that Bloodborne's designers embedded throughout. Nothing in this game is coincidental. The clinic is a beginning, not an end. It is the first indication that Yharnam's horror has a bureaucratic infrastructure behind it, that the nightmare of the night of the hunt was not random, but was built deliberately over a long time by people with credentials and good intentions and a willingness to do things that could not survive scrutiny. The good intentions are the worst part. They always are. What stays with you, after you understand all of it, is not the transformed survivors. It is Ariana's stillborn child. It is Adela's fear. It is the real Iosefka crawling toward you at the end of her own clinic. Barely recognizable, not aggressive enough to be threatening, just present in a way that asks you to look at her. The clinic does not scream at you. It just shows you what it did, and it waits. Chapter 2. The Orphanage and What Was Bred There. The orphanage in Bloodborne is easy to miss. It sits at the top of the cathedral ward, accessible through the grand cathedral area, and most players walk through it fairly quickly, because the enemies there are manageable and the items are useful but not immediately revelatory. It is only when you sit with what the orphanage represents in the context of the broader lore that it becomes one of the most quietly horrifying locations in the game. The name itself is doing a lot of work. An orphanage implies children. It implies care, or at least the institutional performance of care. It implies that someone decided these children needed to be gathered together, housed together, maintained together. In Bloodborne's Yharnam, that kind of institutional decision always has a reason, and the reason is never purely humanitarian. The Healing Church operated the orphanage. That much is suggested by its location and its architectural relationship to the rest of the cathedral ward complex. The church's buildings in this area form a connected system, and the orphanage sits at a specific point in that system that suggests it was not separate from the church's other operations but integral to them. The children in the orphanage were selected. This is implied by the item descriptions connected to the location and by the enemy types you find there. The Winter Lantern enemies, which appear later in the game in the Nightmare of Mensis, are connected through the lore to subjects who underwent specific transformations, and some of the threads point back toward the church's work with carefully chosen individuals. The concept of good blood comes up repeatedly in Bloodborne's lore. Certain bloodlines, certain lineages, carried properties that made their blood more responsive to the old blood's effects, more capable of achieving what the church wanted to achieve. The vile blood queen Annalise and her covenant are connected to this concept on one end of the spectrum. On the other end, the church itself was looking for bloodlines that would respond in specific ways to specific transfusions. Children from these bloodlines, orphaned or otherwise separated from their families, would have been exactly the kind of resource an institution like the Healing Church would want to gather and maintain, not out of cruelty for its own sake, but out of the cold logic of a research program that had decided human beings were its primary material. The orphanage was a supply chain component. The orphanage also connects to the concept of the Edon Writhe rune, which relates to the Great One Eden and to the collection of blood. Odon is a Great One, who exists only in voice and in blood, having no physical form, and the Church's interest in Odon relates to the reproductive possibilities suggested by that Great One's relationship to blood. This is a deliberately uncomfortable area of the lore, and the game does not linger on it directly, but the connection between the orphanage and Edon's influence points towards something about what the children were being prepared for. The Rom connection is worth examining here. Rom, the vacuous spider, was once a human who underwent a transformation connected to the choir's research. Rom's role in the law is to maintain a veil of illusion over the nightmare of Mensis, preventing people from directly perceiving the truth of what is happening there. Rom is described as vacuous, meaning empty, and the implication is that the transformation removed something essential while leaving the body functional. If the orphanage was connected to producing subjects suitable for this kind of transformation, that changes how you think about the children who were housed there. They were not being protected from Yharnam's streets. They were being maintained in a controlled environment until they were ready to be used. The choir Intelligencer Edgar is an enemy you encounter in the area, and his presence there, rather than in a purely ecclesiastical setting, suggests that the orphanage was under active choir oversight, not just passive church administration. The choir's involvement elevates the location's purpose from charitable institution to active research site. The architecture of the orphanage itself is telling. It is ornate in the way that the church's buildings are ornate, built to impress and to communicate authority, but the specific rooms and their layouts suggest functions beyond simple housing. There are areas that read more like examination rooms than dormitories. There are spaces that suggest processing rather than habitation. The building is wearing the aesthetic of care while containing the infrastructure of something else. The formless Edon rune, connected to the Great One who the Church was most directly studying in terms of reproductive and transformative blood properties, is found in the area connected to the orphanage's broader complex. The physical proximity of this rune to the location where children were housed is not accidental in a game that places items and environmental details with this much intentionality. The blood of children in Bloodborne's lore carries specific properties distinct from adult blood. This is touched on in several item descriptions across the game, most of them connected to the Healing Church's research. Young blood, blood from subjects who had not yet fully developed, responded to the old blood differently. The transformations it enabled were different in character, different in degree. This is part of why the Church would have maintained a separate facility for young subjects. The horror of the orphanage compounds. When you consider the timeline, Yharnam had been receiving blood ministration for generations by the time of the game's events. The city's transformation was not sudden. It happened gradually, over decades, with each generation receiving slightly more blood, slightly more exposure, slightly more change. Children born into this system had already been affected before they arrived at the orphanage, and the Church's records would have tracked which children showed which properties. The selection process for the orphanage, then, was likely ongoing and systematic. Church officials, possibly dressed in their roles as healers or administrators, would have identified candidates throughout the city. Children who showed early signs of the right kind of transformation, who came from the right bloodlines, who displayed properties the Church's research flagged as useful, would have been gathered. The gathering itself could have been framed entirely charitably. Orphaned children, children from families who could not care for them, children whose parents had already succumbed to the beast plague. The framing matters because it means the orphanage could have operated openly without anyone outside the Church understanding what it was actually for. Even the people who worked in the lower tiers of the Church might not have known what happened to the children beyond a certain point in their development. The choir's work was kept separate from the lower Church's work, and the orphanage sat at the boundary between those two tiers. The celestial emissary connection comes back here as well. Some of the subjects in the orphanage, if the law is read in a certain way, may have been early candidates for the transformation process that the clinic was later applying to adult survivors. Children, smaller and more pliable, and already changed by generations of blood ministration, might have been the original test subjects. The adult version, applied in the clinic, might have come later. The emissaries themselves, if you look at them, have a quality that reads as both innocent and wrong. They move with something that is almost curiosity. They cluster together. They have a social behavior that is more than animal, even if it is less than human. If they were once children, some of that childhood behavior might have persisted through the transformation, which would explain why they behave the way they do, rather than acting like simple, hostile enemies. The giant celestial emissary that grows during the boss fight seems to emerge from, or be connected to the group of smaller ones. The mechanics of that fight could be read as a kind of collective, as if the group shares something that can concentrate into a single larger expression. If the group was once a collection of children who went through the same process together, the boss fight would have a meaning that goes well beyond a standard encounter. The items you pick up in the orphanage include things that connect to the church's educational mission, to the books and teachings that were used to instill the church's theology in young minds before any physical transformation began. The ideological preparation preceded the physical. Children in the orphanage would have been taught to understand and welcome what the church intended for them, framed in the language of ascension and purpose and becoming something greater. That is one of the most consistently disturbing elements of the Healing Church's methodology. They believed what they were doing was good. They had a coherent theology that explained why the transformations were positive, why becoming closer to the Great Ones was the highest aspiration, why the loss of human form was not a loss, but a graduation. And they shared that theology with the people, including the children, who they were about to transform. The consent, or the simulation of consent, was part of the process. The church did not simply take people and change them without preparation. They built a worldview first, one in which the people being transformed would understand and even desire the outcome. The orphanage was one of the places where that worldview was installed earliest, at the age when it would take deepest root. The alternative reading, that some children in the orphanage were not prepared or willing, but were simply taken and processed, is also supported by elements of the law. The church's history includes coercion alongside theology. Not everyone was a willing participant. Some of the subjects in the research hall above the clinic were there involuntarily, and the connection between the research hall and the orphanage's population is not entirely theoretical. The Pthumerians, who are the ancestral connection to the Great One's influence on Yharnam, had their own relationship with young subjects and transformation. The Pthumerian queen encountered in the deepest chalice dungeons suggests a bloodline specifically shaped over generations by proximity to the Great Ones. The Church's interest in children with specific bloodlines connects directly to this Pthumerian history. They were not inventing a new process. They were continuing one that had been running for much longer. The orphanage is placed architecturally above most of the cathedral wall's major landmarks, which gives it a visual position that suggests prominence and importance. It is literally above the Grand Cathedral. In a city where the church's physical structures communicate its theology, the orphanage's position is significant. Whatever happened there was not peripheral to the church's mission. It was near the top of it. The game gives you very little in the way of direct survivor testimony from the orphanage. There are no ghosts, no notes, no audio logs in the way some games would handle this. What you get instead is the environment, the items, the enemies, and the connections to other parts of the lore. You are expected to do the work of understanding what you are seeing. And that expectation is part of what makes the discovery so effective. When you understand the orphanage, you understand it quietly. There is no dramatic reveal. You just piece it together from what is in front of you. And then you stand in a building that was an orphanage, and you think about the children who lived there, and what happened to them. And the game just continues. The sun does not come out, the music does not change. The weight of it settles into the broader horror of Yharnam, and stays there. The Healing Church's use of children as research subjects, framed within an institutional structure that looked like charity, is one of the darkest things Bloodborne implies. It is never stated outright. It is suggested, carefully, through a combination of environmental design and item text, and the logic of the world systems. But once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and every subsequent interaction with the church's iconography and architecture carries that knowledge with it. The orphans themselves left no record that the game directly shows you. They exist in the orphanage only as an implication, a population that was there and is no longer there, replaced by what you see when you walk through the building now. The absence is as disturbing as any presence would have been. The church had a word for what it was doing: ascension. becoming, the language of spiritual elevation, applied to a physical process that destroyed the people it was applied to in any sense that mattered to the people themselves. The orphanage was where they started that process as early as they possibly could, when the minds being shaped were most receptive and the blood being worked with was most responsive. That is the orphanage. That is what it was, and Bloodborne puts it right there in the game. Above the grand cathedral, built in the church's finest architectural style, accessible through the same door that leads to one of the game's most significant boss encounters. It is not hidden, it is just waiting for you to understand it. Chapter 3: The Fishing Hamlet and the Price of Knowledge. The Fishing Hamlet is one of the last areas in the Old Hunters DLC, and it is one of the most geographically and tonally distinct places in the entire game. It is a coastal village that feels genuinely alien compared to the Gothic architecture of Yharnam. And that alienness is not accidental. The people who lived there were connected to something that predated the Healing Church, predated Yharnam's transformation, predated most of what the game's primary horror is built around. The villagers of the fishing hamlet knew the truth. That is the essential thing about them. They had contact with the Great One, specifically with Kos, or some say Cosm, the dead god washed up on their shore, and they understood what the Great Ones actually were, in a way that the Healing Church never quite managed. The Church sought the Great Ones through research and theology and blood. The fishing hamlet had won literally on their beach. Kos is dead when you encounter her. The massive, cetacean body lies on the shore of the nightmare of the hunter, inaccessible and already long decayed, yet still radiating something, still connected to the orphan who tears itself from her womb when you approach. The death of Kos is part of the fishing hamlet's story, and that story is one of the most explicitly brutal things the game describes. The Tomb of the Gods in the fishing hamlet, which refers to the Great One Kos's resting place, was found by hunters and scholars. The item description for the Kos parasite describes the moment of that discovery. The parasite, which is an entity that lives symbiotically within Kos, would writhe when wielded by those with enough insight, as if still searching for its host. The scholars who came to the hamlet took what they found. They took it apart. Ludwig is the most famous of the church hunters, and the church's hunter workshop was built after the death of Gehrman's original workshop. But before Ludwig, before the church hunters, as a formal institution, there were hunters who operated under the direct guidance of the church's research apparatus. These early hunters went to the fishing hamlet and they took samples. They took the parasites from Kos's body. They took what they could from the villagers who had been changed by generations of proximity to their coastal Great One. The villagers of the fishing hamlet were changed by Kos in ways that the game describes through their appearance. They are fish-like, partially scaled, their bodies reflecting long contact with a being that had its own nature entirely separate from the Great Ones the church was studying. The transformation in the hamlet was not the church's transformation. It was organic, generational, the result of living near something incomprehensibly vast for long enough that you start to reflect it. The hunters who came were not respectful of what they found. The lore suggests strongly, through the accursed brew and the milkweed rune and the Orphan of Kos boss encounter, that the villagers were killed. Not all of them, not at once, but killed, experimented on, used as subjects in the same way the clinic would later use its patients, except the hamlet's villagers had done nothing except live where they lived and know what they knew. The Orphan of Kos, the boss you fight at the end of the hamlet's area, is born from the corpse of its dead mother and immediately wails. The wail is unlike any sound in the game. It is raw and wrong and enormous, and the fight that follows is one of the most genuinely emotional boss encounters in Bloodborne. Not because it is particularly personal for the player character, but because the orphan's behavior reads as grief. The orphan moves erratically, attacks desperately, and in its second phase seems to become something else, something that channels the anger of its dead parents' violation in a way that feels elemental. When you defeat the orphan, the nightmare begins to unravel. Gehrman, who you fight as the final boss of the main game, was connected to the hunter dream, and the hunter dream was built on the sins of the hunters who went to the fishing hamlet. The nightmare of the hunter exists partly as a space where those sins are replayed and maintained. The connection between the hamlet and Gehrman is one of the DLC's most significant revelations. Gehrman built the hunter dream. Lady Maria, the most personal of the DLC's story threads, was one of the hunters who went to the fishing hamlet, and she could not live with what was done there. The fishing hamlet is why Maria sealed herself in the astral clock tower. It is why she refuses the life that the hunter dream would perpetuate for her. Maria's fight in the clock tower is one of the game's most mechanically beautiful encounters, but it is also one of its most narratively dense. She burns away her own blood in the second phase, a gesture that reads as deliberate purification, an attempt to remove the taint of what she did. The blood she burns was changed by contact with the hamlet and with Kos, and she does not want it anymore. She would rather fight without it. The use of the fishing hamlet as a resource extraction site by the church hunters reflects something that runs through the entire game. The Great Ones and the things connected to them are resources to the church. Blood is a resource. Insight is a resource. The hamlet and its people and its dead god are all resources to be taken apart and used and catalogued. The villagers themselves, changed and coastal and knowing, are just a byproduct of the resource that the church actually wanted. What the hamlet's villagers knew, and what the church seems to have partially understood through taking their knowledge by force, was something about the nature of the Great Ones that went beyond what Yharnam's blood ministration was reaching. The Great Ones, the church studied through blood and ritual, were enormous and alien but still somewhat comprehensible. Kos seems to have been something else, something that operated on a different register entirely. The Kos parasite, the weapon you can collect from the area, deals arcane damage and in its description is described as still searching for Kos. The parasite is not dead. It is separated. It continues to function and to reach for a host that no longer exists. This detail transforms what might have been a simple weapon pickup into a melancholy object, a living thing that has been displaced from its context and continues to exist in the wrong circumstances. The milkweed rune, which transforms the hunter into a plant-like being in specific chalice dungeon contexts, is connected to the hamlet through Rakuyo, Maria's weapon, and through the notes left in the area. The rune speaks to becoming a vessel for what the Great Ones lost, which connects to the orphan and to Kos's death, and to the question of what happens to the relationship between a Great One and the people it was connected to when the Great One is taken apart. The villagers who survive in the hamlet in the nightmare state are hostile, but they are not beasts. They are people in some fundamental sense that the beastly enemies elsewhere in the game have ceased to be. They speak, after a fashion. They have formations. They have the coherence of a community that has been devastated but not destroyed. They attack you because you are a hunter, and hunters are what destroyed them. That detail, that the villagers in the nightmare attack hunters, specifically because hunters are what did this to them, makes the combat in the fishing hamlet feel different from combat elsewhere in the game. You are not fighting monsters, you are fighting people who have very good reasons to try to kill anyone who looks like what you look like. The game does not make this explicit. It does not tell you to feel bad about fighting them. But if you know the lore, every fishing hamlet enemy that you cut down is a richer and more uncomfortable experience than a standard enemy encounter. The amygdalae that appear in certain areas of the cathedral ward and later in the game are watchers. The lore suggests they watch over sites connected to the Great Ones and their influence. There are no amygdalae in the fishing hamlet, the place where a Great One actually died, the place where the most direct contact happened, is unguarded by those watchers. The implication is that whatever the hamlet once had, it no longer has it. The Great Ones that watch did not come to watch over Kos. The fishing hamlet is also a physical place that does not fit neatly into Yharnam's geography. The DLC areas exist in a nightmare state, but within that state, the hamlet has a specificity and solidity that makes it feel like a real place, a place that actually existed before it was translated into nightmare. The smell of the sea, the architecture of the village, the physical presence of Kos on the shore, all of it reads as memory rather than construction. The nightmare preserves what was. The fishing hamlet nightmare is the preservation of a moment, specifically of the moment of its destruction. This is consistent with how the hunter dream functions, as a space where what happened is maintained and repeated. The Hamlet's nightmare is not a version of the Hamlet where things are fine. It is the Hamlet at the moment, and in the state of its violation. One of the more subtle details in the Hamlet is the presence of items and enemies that connect to the Great One Eden, rather than to Kos. Odon is the formless Great One associated with blood, and the Church's research into Odon was separate from whatever the Hamlet represented. The fact that Eden-connected elements appear in the Hamlet suggests that the hunters who came there were not studying Kos exclusively. They were using the Hamlet as a general research site, taking from it whatever they could extract, regardless of which Great One it was connected to. The scale of what the hunters took from the fishing hamlet is suggested but never fully quantified. The Kos parasite is one item. The knowledge in various item descriptions is another. The bodies of the villagers who were used as subjects fed into the research hall's work. The blood of the hamlet's changed population was presumably catalogued. The law points toward a systematic extraction that went on long enough to be comprehensive, rather than a single raid. The aftermath of that extraction is what you walk through in the hamlet. The village persists as a memory. The villagers persist as shells of people who know what was done to them. Kos persists as a dead body on a shore where nothing will ever grow. And the orphan persists as the first cry of something born into a world that has already been taken from it, with nothing left to do but rage. Chapter 4. The School of Mensis and the Men Who Looked at God. The School of Mensis is one of Bloodborne's most ambitious and disturbing factions, and understanding what they were actually doing in the nightmare of Mensis changes how you read everything in that area. These were scholars, researchers, people who had studied the healing church's work and decided that the church was moving too slowly, being too cautious, adhering too closely to theological protocols that they saw as obstacles rather than safeguards. Mensis made contact with Murgo. That is the core of what happened, and it is stated relatively clearly in the game. Murgo is a Great One's child, or something equivalent to one, a being whose cries maintain the terrible unending night over Yharnam, and whose presence in the nightmare is what draws the hunter there in the late game. The School of Mensis found Murgo and established a connection, and the result was catastrophic for most of them. The brain in the nightmare of Mensis, the enormous fleshy thing that hangs in the area and that can drain your insight points just by being looked at, is described in its item context as the product of the Mensis ritual. The scholars who participated in the ritual that connected them to Murgo did not survive the process with their minds intact. Their consciousness was, in some sense, extracted and placed into or merged with the brain. What you see hanging there is the collective remnant of the School of Mensis. The bodies of the scholars you find in the waking version of the Mensis complex, Yhargul, the unseen village, are wearing iron helmets. The helmets are important. The iron protects against insight drain, against the direct perception of things the human mind was not built to perceive. The scholars who went into the ritual knew they were doing something dangerous to their cognition, and some of them took protective measures. The ones who survived as human bodies in the waking world did so because they were wearing the helmets. The ones who were not wearing helmets, or who removed them during the ritual, or who were present in the nightmare when the contact was made, became part of the brain. Their identities dissolved, their individual consciousness merged into a collective entity that no longer thinks in human terms, that simply exists and drains the insight of anyone who looks directly at it. The ritual itself involved the use of a ringing bell and specific conditions established in the nightmare. Mensis had found a way to reach into the nightmare of Mensis and to make contact with what was there, and they did it deliberately and with preparation. They were not victims of accident. They chose to do this. They chose to expose themselves to something that they knew was beyond the capacity of human minds to contain without damage. Why? The same reason the healing church chose to push its research further and further, the same reason the imposter, Yosefka, administered transfusions to herself, the same reason Logarius imprisoned himself with Annalise rather than simply killing her. Everyone in Bloodborne who reaches toward the great ones, believes they are reaching towards something worth reaching for. The school of Mensis believed that direct contact with the Great One's child, unmediated by blood or ritual or theology, would achieve what the Church's more cautious approach never could. The achievement they were looking for was insight in its most literal form, not the mechanical resource the game tracks, but actual understanding of the nature of the Great Ones and the cosmos they represent. Mensis believed that understanding was possible, that a human mind, properly prepared, could receive and contain genuine cosmic knowledge rather than just being destroyed by it. They were wrong. The brain tells you that. The iron-helmed corpses tell you that. The nightmare of Mensis, which is a space warped around the presence of Murgo and made habitable only because of what Mensis did there, tells you that. The price of the contact they made was most of their minds, and what they got in return was not understanding, it was proximity. They got close to something vast, and the closeness took what they had and left the remnant hanging in the dark. Mikolash, the host of the nightmare, is the most visible surviving member of the School of Mensis, and he is one of the game's most unsettling boss encounters precisely because he still sounds like a person. He quotes Carol runes. He speaks about eyes on the inside. He runs from you through a maze of mirrors, and when cornered, he fights desperately. And when you finally kill him, he says he doesn't want to go, which is one of the most nakedly human things anyone in Bloodborne says. Mikolash wore the Mensis cage on his head, which is a smaller version of the iron helmet design. The cage was meant to serve as a kind of tuning device to help the wearer receive transmissions from the Great Ones more clearly. The fact that Mikolash wears it permanently in the nightmare as part of his identity suggests that he has moved beyond using it as a tool and now genuinely believes it defines who he is in relation to what Mensis accomplished. His dialogue, which you catch in fragments as he leads you through the maze, references Grantus eyes, a phrase that connects to the idea of gaining the ability to perceive what is normally hidden. Insight as a physical change to the perceiver, rather than simply an accumulation of knowledge. Mikolash wanted to see. He wanted to be changed in a way that allowed him to see. And he got something, or believes he did, even if what he got is not what he was hoping for. The nightmare of Mensis, as a physical space, is organized around the brain and around Murgo's presence. The wet nurses who protect Murgo are encountered there, enormous avian beings with multiple arms and blank-faced masks. These are guardians or servants of something that is itself just a sound, a cry. Murgo exists in the nightmare as a wailing that never stops, and the wet nurse manifests to fight you specifically when you approach that wailing. The killing of Murgo is one of the most ambiguous endings you can pursue in Bloodborne. The game tells you that Murgo's passing is complete, and that the night of the hunt will end, and you get a cutscene of the moon turning red and finally blue, suggesting the nightmare lifting. But Murgo is a Great One's child. Killing a Great One's child is not something the game treats as simple, and the fact that this is one of the endings you can pursue says something about the nature of the choices the game is offering you. The School of Mensis, in its ambition and its failure and its grotesque remnant form, is a cautionary structure built into the game's middle section. You encounter it after you have already seen what the Healing Church did, with cautious, systematic research. Mensis is what happens when the caution is abandoned entirely, when you decide that the protocols exist because the authorities making them are conservative, and not because the thing you are reaching for is genuinely capable of destroying you. The scholars who became the brain were not stupid. They were brilliant. They had studied the Church's work and understood it well enough to develop their own approach. They had prepared the ritual with care and built the Mensis complex with purpose. The fact that they failed, despite all of that preparation, suggests something about the nature of what they were attempting that goes beyond a simple story about hubris. What Mensis attempted was perhaps not possible at all. The contact they made was real, but the kind of contact that leaves most of your consciousness merged into a hanging brain is not a form of success by any standard that the scholars themselves would have endorsed before the ritual. The nightmare they created is a trap as much as an achievement, a space where what was done cannot be undone, and what was lost cannot be recovered. The iron-helmed corpses in Yharnam have a specific detail. Some of them are sitting. Some of them are in postures that suggest they were present for something and simply stopped partway through. The ritual that connected Mensis to Murgo apparently happened during a version of the night of the hunt, and some scholars who were not participating directly were caught in the backlash. The nightmare pulled them in to some degree without pulling them all the way in. Those sitting corpses, the ones in between, are perhaps the most disturbing. The ones who became the brain at least have a form of continued existence. The ones who died outright at least have a form of conclusion. The ones sitting there in their iron helmets, in positions of arrested motion, are suspended in something in between, and there is no law that definitively says what happened to them or what they experienced in the moment of the ritual. The Mensis cage, the Mensis scholar enemy type, and the architecture of the nightmare all feed into a picture of an organization that was entirely sincere in its ambitions and entirely unprepared for the actual experience of what it was reaching for. The great ones do not care about the people reaching for them. Murgo is not aware of the school of Mensis as individual scholars with names and histories. The contact was made, and what happened to the people making it was irrelevant to the thing being contacted. That indifference is a recurring theme in Bloodborne's treatment of the Great Ones. They are not malevolent, they are not benevolent. They simply are, on a scale that makes the specific experiences of individual humans as irrelevant to them as individual cells are to a human. Mensis believed that the contact, properly achieved, would create a relationship. What it actually created was a brain. Chapter 5: The Beast Plague and What the Blood Was Doing All Along. The Beast Plague is the surface horror of Bloodborne, the thing you see immediately, and that the game uses to establish its world from the first moments you step outside Iosefka's clinic. Yharnam is full of people who have transformed into beasts, and the night of the hunt is the city's response to that transformation. But the plague is not what it appears to be on the surface, and understanding what the blood was actually doing to the people of Yharnam over generations makes the entire city's history one of the most disturbing things in the game. The old blood was found in the Pthumerian ruins beneath Yharnam. The healing church, specifically Lawrence and the scholars who accompanied him, discovered it there and recognized its medical properties immediately. The blood could heal. It could extend life. It could restore function to bodies damaged beyond conventional treatment. For a city that was effectively built on trade in the 18th century sense, the discovery was transformative in every sense. The church built its medical apparatus around blood ministration. Citizens of Yharnam came to the church for healing and received transfusions of the old blood. The healing was real. The blood genuinely worked in the short term, and word spread, and more people came, and the city grew around the church's ability to offer what no one else could offer. Yharnam became a destination for the sick and the desperate from all over the world. The beast plague is what the blood was doing in the background while it healed. Every transfusion nudged the recipient a small amount in the direction of transformation. The healing was real, but the long-term effect of repeated exposure was a gradual destabilization of the boundary between human and beast that was already present in old blood, because it came from a place where that boundary had already been crossed. The Pthumerians, who left the blood behind, had been changed by their proximity to the Great Ones, and the old blood carried that change. The citizens of Yharnam who received blood ministration over years and decades were not being healed toward health. They were being healed toward a transformation that would eventually overwhelm their human form. The church knew this, at some level, because the evidence of what the old blood did to people was visible in the Pthumerian ruins where they found it. The Pthumerian tombs contain evidence of what happened to that civilization over time. The beast plague did not arrive in Yharnam. It grew there, slowly, across generations until the accumulated exposure reached a threshold that the city could no longer contain. By the time the hunts began, the transformation was not a new phenomenon. It was the visible endpoint of something that had been building for a long time in the blood of everyone who had ever lived in Yharnam and received ministration. The hunters who were created to manage the plague were themselves products of the same blood system. Hunters receive more blood than ordinary citizens because blood is what gives them their superhuman capabilities, their speed and strength and ability to survive wounds that would kill a normal person. The irony is structural. The institution created to manage the beast plague is run on the same substance that causes the beast plague, and the people within that institution are more exposed to it than anyone else. Every hunter in Bloodborne is on a countdown. The more you use blood vials to heal, the more you are doing to yourself what the citizens of Yharnam did over generations in a compressed time frame. The game's mechanics are not abstract. They are a description of a process that has a specific end point, one that every hunter eventually faces if they live long enough and use enough blood. Gehrman, who is the oldest hunter you know about, managed to avoid the beast plague by being bound to the dream, which seems to have suspended the process for him. The dream is a place outside of time in certain respects, and German's connection to it has kept him human, or human adjacent, for much longer than any person could normally remain so while working as a hunter. But the connection to the dream has its own costs, which is what the game's ending sequences are about. The beast transformation is not uniform. The game shows you many different kinds of beasts, from the relatively simple werewolf-type enemies in the early game, to the enormous and complex forms of bosses, like the cleric beast and Vicar Amelia. The variation suggests that the transformation takes different shapes in different people, shaped by the specific properties of their blood, their exposure level, their psychological state, and possibly by factors the game does not explain directly. Vicar Amelia is one of the most emotionally difficult beasts to fight because she is still praying when you enter the cathedral ward. She is enormous. She is clearly transformed beyond any point of return. But she is on her knees, attempting to maintain something human, attempting to hold on to whatever the grand cathedral represented for her before the blood took her too far. The prayer continues even as she attacks you, and the lunarium key you find on her connects to the gesture she was performing in her final conscious moments. The beast plague is also not an ending. The beasts in Yharnam are not simply dead people in monster suits. Many of them retain fragments of behavior that suggests ongoing cognitive activity. They respond to sound, they react to threat. Some of them demonstrate behaviors that look like memory. The cleric beast, once a high-ranking church official, moves in ways that echo ecclesiastical gestures, even in its transformed state. The blood did not simply switch off the person and switch on a monster. It changed the person into something that is not the same person, but carries the ghost of that person. The insight mechanic in the game, which is directly connected to how many beasts and Great One connected things you have encountered, affects what you can perceive. At high insight, you can see things that are invisible at lower insight levels, including the amygdalae that cling to the buildings of the cathedral ward. The citizens of Yharnam cannot see the amygdalae. Their insight is low enough that those massive beings are simply absent from their perceptual field. This connects to the beast plague in a specific way. The insight you accumulate is the product of exposure to the things that the blood contains. The blood is a vector for Great One influence, and that influence, accumulated over enough time and exposure, opens the perceiver to things that are normally outside human perception. The beast plague is one outcome of that process. The expanded perception of the hunter is another. The two are connected because they both come from the same source. The citizens of Yharnam who can still speak, the few who remain non-transformed enough to interact with you, are mostly barricaded in their homes, terrified and hostile. They throw things from windows, they warn you away. Some of them are clearly in early stages of transformation, their voices already thickened, their behavior already narrowed. They know something is happening to them, but most of them do not know that the blood they trusted is what is doing it. The church knew. The church knew, because the church found the old blood in a place that contained the entire history of what old blood does to people over time. They built their institution on that blood, and they kept giving it to people, and they managed the symptoms with hunters, and they called the management a sacred duty, and they kept giving people more blood. The scale of the deception, if deception is even the right word for something that the perpetrators had convinced themselves was a form of medicine, is vast. Every citizen of Yharnam who received blood ministration, every pilgrim who came from outside the city seeking healing, Every generation born into a city where blood was simply what you used when you were sick, all of them were receiving something that was incrementally destroying their humanity. The blood does not feel bad. This is perhaps the most insidious thing about it. The game never suggests that the people receiving it experienced anything other than healing. They felt better. Their wounds closed. Their diseases retreated. The transformation was slow enough that by the time it became visible, the person had been receiving blood for long enough that it was simply part of how they understood their own body. The change was normalized incrementally. The beast plague is the visible endpoint of a process that felt, at every step, like medicine. And the city of Yharnam, built around that medicine, burning through the night of the hunt, full of people who chose the blood and who cannot undo that choice, is one of the most disturbing things that Bloodborne builds for you to walk through. It is a city that did this to itself, was done to by others, and cannot now separate one from the other. Chapter 6. Canehurst and the Blood That Remembered. Canehurst is a different kind of horror than most of what Yharnam offers, where the city is gothic decay and screaming bodies in the streets. Canehurst is aristocratic silence. The castle sits in the snow, reached by a phantom coach, and its inhabitants are the vile bloods, nobles who refused the healing church's authority and chose a different blood, one that came from a different source entirely. Queen Annalise of Canehurst is still there when you arrive, sitting on her throne, indestructible in a way that the game makes mechanically literal. She cannot be killed permanently. Ligarius, the healing church hunter, who came to Canehurst and destroyed the court, could not bring himself to kill her, and instead became a living seal, wearing himself out over years, keeping her imprisoned in her own castle, preventing what she carried from spreading. The Vile Blood Covenant and its associated lore paint a picture of a bloodline that carries something distinct from the old blood of the Puthumerans. The blood of Canehurst is described as impure, or as a corruption, depending on which church source you are reading. But the church's definitions of purity are themselves suspect, given what the church was doing with pure blood. The vile blood designation is a church label applied by an institution with its own complex relationship to blood contamination. What the vile blood actually does is suggested by Annalise's immortality and by the behavior of the blood dregs that accumulate in certain areas. Blood dregs are described as being present in the blood of hunters, who are impure, which connects them to certain kinds of violent or morally compromised action. Annalise collects blood dregs through the covenant, and the collection serves a purpose, one that points toward the birth of a new vile blood heir. The horror of Canehurst is not the same as the horror of the orphanage or the clinic. It is the horror of a system that has been frozen, that has been placed on pause by a single man's refusal to complete his mission. Ligarius came to destroy the vile bloods, and instead became a warden, maintaining the imprisonment of a queen who cannot die, and who continues to pursue her goal even from within that imprisonment. The Canehurst vile bloods were nobility, which means they had resources and privacy and the ability to conduct their own research outside the church's oversight. The blood they used was different from the old blood, and the things it did to them were different. The Canehurst ghosts, the enemies you fight in the castle, retain aristocratic airs even in their transformed states. They attack with weapons and with grace. They have not lost the cultural programming of their class, even as they have lost their living bodies. The connection between Canehurst and the Great One Eden is suggested by the blood dregs and by Annalise's purpose. If the Vile Blood Queen is collecting dregs to produce a new heir to the Vile Blood lineage, and if that lineage is connected to Edon's formless nature and interest in blood, then Annalise's project is a version of the same thing the Healing Church was doing with its more medically framed approach. Both are trying to produce something that connects human blood to Great One nature. They just use different blood and different methods and different language. Ligarius believed he was acting righteously by imprisoning Annalise rather than completing his mission to destroy the vile bloods. The game gives you his diary notes in fragments, and they read as the record of a man convincing himself that what he is doing is the right choice, while his body slowly gives out from the sustained effort of maintaining his vigil. By the time you reach the rooftop of Canehurst and fight him, He has been there long enough to have become something more than human in his own right. The Ligarius fight is one of Bloodborne's most elaborate boss encounters, and Ligarius himself is not a beast. He is a man who has pushed himself past ordinary human limits through sustained magical exertion and has come out the other side into something that resembles a great one's proxy more than a human being. The crown of illusions that he wears, which hides Annalise's location from anyone who does not take it from his body, is the symbol of a choice he made and spent everything sustaining. What Ligarius did to himself in Cainhurst reflects something the game shows you repeatedly in different forms. The pursuit of a specific goal, carried far enough and long enough, changes the person pursuing it into something shaped by that pursuit. Ligarius wanted to imprison Annalise. He is now the prison. The irony is not coincidental. Cainhurst Castle also contains the Cainhurst Vilebloods, who were not present when Ligarius arrived, or who survived in some form after his purge. The item descriptions connected to them suggest a court that was aware of what it was doing with the blood it kept, and that had its own sophisticated understanding of the Great One's relationship to human lineages. Cainhurst was not ignorant. It was in competition with the Church, and that competition was about who would produce the next thing to emerge from the intersection of human and Great One biology. The snowy isolation of Cainhurst suggests how long the castle has been sealed. Winter in a Gothic setting is a standard image, but in Bloodborne's world, where most of the game takes place in a single night, the permanent snow of Cainhurst suggests a place that has been outside of time in some sense. The phantom coach that takes you there appears only under specific conditions, and the castle itself does not seem to exist in exactly the same relationship to Yharnam's geography as everything else. This temporal or spatial displacement of Cainhurst mirrors what the nightmare spaces do in the DLC. Something about Cainhurst's history has partially removed it from the normal world, keeping it preserved in a state connected to events that happened long ago. The court that Ligarius destroyed is still there in ghost form. The queen is still there in physical form. The blood that the Vilebloods kept is still there in whatever form that blood takes, when the people who carried it are no longer fully alive. The one thing Annalise says that stays with you if you interact with her as a Covenant member is the framing she uses for the Vileblood project. She speaks of it not as a personal ambition, but as a destiny, as if the blood itself is pointing towards something, and she is simply facilitating that pointing. This is not a villain's monologue about power. It is something quieter and stranger. A woman who has been sitting in a ruined castle for years or centuries, still convinced that what she is doing matters in a way that will outlast the immediate circumstances. That conviction, held by someone who has been isolated long enough, that their only company is ghosts and the occasional hunter who finds the coach, is its own kind of horror. Annalise is not suffering in the way that the clinic's patients suffer. She is not transformed in the way that the hamlet's villagers were transformed. She is waiting, with complete confidence that the waiting will be worth it, for something that may or may not still be possible. Chapter 7. The Doll, the Dream, and the Price Gehrman Paid. The doll in the hunter's dream is one of Bloodborne's most discussed characters, and most discussions focus on her gentleness, her warmth, the strange comfort of her presence in a game that is otherwise relentlessly hostile. She is kind in a way that almost nothing else in the game is kind, and that kindness is part of what makes understanding her situation so quietly devastating. The doll was created by Gehrman to resemble Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. Gehrman cared about Maria. The game does not state this directly, but the combination of the doll's existence, Gehrman's behavior in the dream, and the item descriptions connected to both of them points towards something that was more than mentorship or professional relationship. Gehrman made a doll that looked and sounded and moved like Maria, and then he interacted with that doll for what appears to have been a very long time. The doll herself is aware of her own nature. She knows she is a doll. She knows that what she represents is a copy of someone else. She says this without apparent distress, with the same gentleness she applies to everything, but the self-awareness combined with her situation is not comfortable to sit with. She exists as an object created by a grieving man to be a substitute for a person who left him or rejected his feelings, or simply moved on. She exists to be what that person was not. The dream itself is Gehrman's prison, as much as it is his home. He built it, or helped build it, and he cannot leave it. The moon presence, the great one most directly associated with the hunter dream, maintains the dream and maintains Gehrman's connection to it. Gehrman is trapped in a nightmare he created, attended by a doll he made, serving a purpose that the moon presence defined after the original collaboration went somewhere Gehrman did not intend. The doll's kindness is not false. She is genuinely caring in every interaction the player has with her. But the origins of that kindness, the fact that she was designed by a man who wanted a companion and who modelled her on someone real, give every gentle word she says a shadow. She is kind because she was made to be kind. Her warmth is a design feature. Lady Maria, the person the doll was modelled on, is one of the most genuinely tragic figures in Bloodborne's lore. She was a hunter, Gehrman's student, and she went to the fishing hamlet and participated in what was done there. The guilt of that participation destroyed her ability to continue as a hunter, and she sealed herself in the clock tower with her memories and her blood weapons, and the subjects of the research hall above. Maria chose the clock tower over the dream. She chose to carry her guilt in a closed space, rather than continue the cycle that the dream represented. This choice meant she was no longer what Gehrman wanted her to be, no longer present in the way he needed her to be. And the doll is the response to that absence. He built a substitute, because the person could not or would not remain. The existential situation of the doll is one of the most quietly disturbing things in Bloodborne, because it is recognizable in a way that cosmic body horror is not. Most people have some understanding of grief and of the ways grief can become unhealthy. The doll is an extreme version of something uncomfortably human, a coping mechanism made physical and given life, and set to work being the thing that was lost. The moon presence's role in all of this is largely opaque, but its relationship to the dream and to Gehrman suggests that the Great One is using the hunter dream as a mechanism for something, possibly for the collection of the blood echoes that hunters accumulate, possibly for something the lore hints at but does not confirm. The moon presence does not appear to have created the dream out of benevolence. It appears to have recognized an opportunity in Gehrman's situation and structured an arrangement that benefits whatever the moon presence is trying to achieve. Gehrman's position in that arrangement is explicitly servile. He tends the dream, he sends hunters out into the night. He seems to genuinely want the hunters he works with to be free of the dream, because he asks you at the end to let him set you free, to let him end your life so that you can wake up outside the dream and be done with it. The alternative to his mercy, from his perspective, is being bound to the dream as he is bound. He is offering you what he cannot have for himself. The doll does not fight. She does not interact with the enemies in the dream. She simply exists there, tending her flowers, speaking to the player with warmth, serving a function in the mechanical systems of the game that is both practical, leveling up, and narrative, emotional anchor. The game designed her to be someone you want to come back to, someone whose presence makes the brutality of the night more bearable. And then, if you pursue the lore, you discover that she is what she is because someone's grief made her. That is not a betrayal of the player's feelings for the doll. The game is not trying to make you feel bad for finding her comforting. It is adding a layer of complication that is consistent with how Bloodborne treats most of the things it initially presents as comfort. The comfortable things in Bloodborne always have something underneath them, and the doll is no exception. Gehrman in his wheelchair at the centre of the dream, muttering in his sleep, is a man who made something terrible in a moment of loss, and then lived inside it long enough that the terrible thing became simply his life. The dream that he built, the doll that he made, the hunters that he sends out and watches return and sends out again, these are all components of a situation that started with a person doing something understandable, even pitiable, and then being locked into that thing by a great one who recognized its utility. The final fight with Gehrman, if you choose it, is a fight with someone who is trying to help you, and cannot imagine that help looking like anything other than mercy killing. He is not evil. He is not a villain in any conventional sense. He is a very old man who built a nightmare and has been living in it for longer than he should have been able to live. Attended by the ghost of someone he loved, in a form that was never actually that person, doing a job that benefits something vast and indifferent. The doll's response to Gehrman's death, if you pursue that ending, is the most direct emotional statement the game makes about their relationship. She mourns him. She mourns him because he made her capable of mourning. He built her to feel the things he felt, or some approximation of them. And so when he is gone, she experiences the loss of him in the way that someone built to feel loss would experience it. The grief is hers. It is also, in a strange way, his grief, replaying in the creation he made to embody the feelings he could not let go of. The doll is Bloodborne's most human horror, and that is saying something in a game full of cosmic monsters and body transformation and institutional atrocity. She is human because what she represents is recognizable. She is disturbing because the recognition does not soften anything. It just makes it closer. Chapter 8. The Pthumerians and what came before everything. Everything in Bloodborne is downstream of something older, and the oldest thing the game shows you directly is the Pthumerian civilization. The Chalice dungeons, which most players treat as optional content for farming blood echoes and gems, are actually the archaeological layer beneath Yharnam's entire history. The Pthumerians were there first, and what happened to them is the template for what later happened to Yharnam. The Pthumerians were human, or started as human, or at least resembled human in ways that the game uses to distinguish them from the Great Ones. They built an advanced civilization in the tunnels beneath what would become Yharnam, and that civilization was organized around proximity to the Great Ones. Not proximity in the cautious, mediated way the Healing Church pursued, but direct proximity, direct contact, a civilization built around and in relationship with beings that operated on a scale entirely beyond human comprehension. The Pthumerian queens, who you encounter as bosses in the deepest Chalice dungeons, have been changed by that proximity in ways that are visible and specific. Their silhouettes are elongated, their movements are wrong. Their attacks draw on sources that the Healing Church's research was only beginning to approach. The queens are not beasts. They are not cosmic entities. They are human beings who have been changed over so many generations of Great One proximity that they are now something in between, something that does not have a clean category. The blood you find in the Pthumerian ruins is old blood. The old blood that the Healing Church discovered, that Lawrence and his scholars found and brought to the surface and built a church on, was left behind by these people. It is their blood, or blood they had been using, blood that carries the accumulated influence of everything they were exposed to over their civilization's entire existence. The Healing Church took that blood and gave it to a new population of people and called it medicine. This is why the beast plague is not accidental and not mysterious. The blood was always going to do this to people, because it had already done this to the people who left it behind. The Pthumerians are what you get after many generations of old blood exposure, and Yharnam is the first generation of that same process, interrupted before it reaches the same endpoint, by the beast plague breaking the surface before the slower transformation could complete. The Keeper of the Old Lords, encountered in the lower dungeons, is one of the oldest non-Queen Pthumerian enemies you face, and it is enveloped in flames, in a way that connects it to Lawrence, and to the Old Blood's particular form of heat. The fire, associated with the Old Lords, is not ordinary fire. It is a fire connected to whatever the Great One's influence does to matter and energy at a fundamental level. The Pthumerian undead, who appear throughout the dungeons as regular enemies, are what the civilization's general population became. Not queens, not bosses, just changed people, preserved by whatever quality the deep dungeons possess, still animated, still responding to intruders, still organized around the principles their civilization was built on. They are ruins that walk. The layout of the Pthumerian dungeons, which the Chalice ritual recreates from memories or residue, or some quality of the blood, suggests a civilization of considerable sophistication. The architecture is ornate and deliberate. The traps are elaborate and well designed. The altars and ritual spaces speak to a complex theology organized around Great One worship. This was not a primitive culture. It was an advanced one that simply had a different relationship to reality than anything that came after it. The Loran Silver Beast and the other Loran-connected enemies suggest a branch of Pthumerian history that went in a different direction, one that produced a different kind of transformation. Loran was a Pthumerian sub-civilization of sorts, connected to the outer edges of the Pthumerian civilization's territory, and what happened to Loran seems to have involved a more beast-like transformation than what happened to the central Pthumerian culture. The two endpoints of Old Blood transformation, the bestial and the cosmic, were both explored by the civilization that left the blood behind. The Eye Hill dungeons, the deepest layer, contain what appear to be the final remnants of the Pthumerian culture's highest achievements. The enemies there are the most changed, the most powerful, the most completely transformed into something that sits at the far end of what Old Blood exposure produces. The Pthumerian queen you find at the very bottom of the chalice system is the apotheosis of what their civilization was building toward, and it is one of the most alien things the game shows you that is still technically human in its origins. The connection between the Pthumerians and the Healing Church is direct and documented, to the extent that anything in Bloodborne is documented. The Church found the ruins. The Church sent scholars and hunters into the ruins. The Church took the blood and the knowledge and the artifacts from those ruins and built an institution on top of them. The Pthumerian legacy is the foundation of everything the game's primary horror is built on. Understanding the Pthumerians means understanding that the horror of Bloodborne is not a recent event. It is the latest chapter in something that has been running for a very long time, that predates Yharnam, that predates the Healing Church, that predates everything you interact with in the main game. The city above and the dungeons below are connected by a continuous thread of Old Blood and Great One influence that has been producing variations of the same outcome for longer than recorded history extends. The Chalice dungeons are not optional. They are the basement. And the basement explains the house. The Pthumerian civilization's end, whatever form that end took, left behind everything the Healing Church needed to build its institution. The blood, the ruins, the knowledge encoded in the items found in those ruins, the evidence of what Old Blood does over time. All of it was there, waiting to be found and used. And the Church found it and used it, without apparently drawing the obvious conclusion about where the same road leads when you follow it. Or perhaps the Church drew that conclusion and decided to follow the road anyway. The lore supports both readings. The evidence of what Old Blood does was present in the ruins. Whether the Church's founders chose to ignore that evidence or chose to proceed despite it is one of Bloodborne's most important ambiguities, and it determines how you understand everything that follows. The Pthumerians offer one final disturbing detail. Their civilization appears to have been aware of what was happening to them. The theology that organized their culture around Great One, proximity suggests a population that understood, or believed it understood, the nature of its transformation. They did not transform accidentally. They transformed on purpose, as part of a project that their entire civilization endorsed and organized itself around. That choice, made by people who apparently understood what they were choosing, and the result of that choice, visible in every Pthumerian enemy and every Chalice dungeon room, is perhaps the darkest thing Bloodborne implies. Not that horror can be done to you, not that institutions can betray you, but that you can walk into horror with your eyes open because you believe in what you are walking toward and end up as something that wanders the ruins of what you built, still animated, still responding, the ghost of a choice made long ago by people who thought they knew what they were doing. That is what the dungeons are. That is what the blood is. And Yharnam is it, happening again. Chapter 9. The Choir and the Eyes They Were Building. The choir is the upper tier of the Healing Church, and most players encounter evidence of its work throughout the Cathedral Ward and the Forbidden Woods, without fully understanding what separates it from the lower church. The distinction matters because the choir was not simply a more senior version of the institution you interact with in the game's early hours. It was a different kind of operation entirely, one that had abandoned the pretense of medicine and was pursuing something that the lower church's theology only gestured toward. The choir's explicit goal was contact with the Great Ones. Not the mediated contact of blood ministration, not the symbolic contact of religious ritual, but direct, unmediated communication with beings that the lower church called gods, and that the choir was attempting to treat more like colleagues. The hubris in that ambition is visible in retrospect. But from inside the choir's framework, it was the logical conclusion of everything the church had been building toward. If the great ones were real, and they demonstrably were, and if they were the source of the insight and power that the church had been cultivating, then the next step was to speak to them directly. The means the choir developed to pursue this goal involved a specific kind of eye. Not a physical eye, though the physical transformation it produced had ocular qualities, but a perceptual organ that could be grown inside the human brain, and that would allow the person carrying it to perceive at frequencies normally unavailable to human consciousness. The eye on the inside, which Mikulash references in his dialogue, and which appears in several item descriptions, is the choir's most significant achievement and its most disturbing one. The process of growing an eye on the inside involved the administration of a specific preparation of the old blood, one more refined than anything the lower church used, combined with other substances that the choir had developed through years of research. The preparation was not stable. The process was painful, in ways the item descriptions do not detail, but the research hall's patients make clear through their behavior. And the result was not guaranteed to produce a functional perceptual organ, rather than simply destroying the brain that contained it. The research hall, which sits above the clinic complex and is accessible through the Old Hunters DLC, is where the choir conducted its eye cultivation research on human subjects. The patients there are the ones who survived long enough to be studied. The ones who did not survive long enough, or who produced the wrong kind of transformation, presumably left the research hall in ways that the game does not need to show you, because the ones who remain are sufficient. The patients in the research hall fall into categories. Some have heads that have swollen enormously, filled with the fluid produced by the transformation process. These are the ones who got further than most, the fluid that leaks from their changed skulls, which Adeline asks you to collect for her, is itself a substance, with properties, a physical byproduct of whatever the brain produces when it starts to grow something new inside itself. The patients who ask for more of it, who drink it and change further, are demonstrating something the choir presumably observed in its research, that the process can be accelerated, that subjects can be pushed along the transformation faster than the blood alone would push them, and that some subjects seem to want that acceleration in a way that bypasses whatever distress the earlier stages produced. Adeline is the most complete version of the transformation you see in the research hall. By the time you bring her enough brain fluid, she has changed to the point where what she is can barely be called the thing she was when the treatment began. She thanks you. The thanks is sincere, not ironic. Whatever the transformation gave her is, from her perspective, a gift, which is consistent with the choir's theology, and which does not make watching it any more comfortable. The eyes that the choir was growing were intended to perceive the great ones more directly. The enlarged heads and leaking fluid are the physical infrastructure for that perception. The body's attempt to accommodate a new kind of processing. Whether it worked, whether any of the research hall's subjects actually achieved the perceptual contact with the great ones that the choir was aiming for, is not clearly stated. But the existence of the fishing hamlet's connection to the choir's work, and the fact that the choir had access to Kosa's remains and the Kos parasite, and the villagers' knowledge suggests that at least some of the research produced results that the church considered worth pursuing further. The choir's use of human subjects for the eye research is consistent with everything else the church did with human subjects, but it has a specific quality that sets it apart. The lower church's experiments were primarily about the blood and what it did to people. The choir's experiments were about perception, about changing what could be seen and known and communicated, about building a bridge between human consciousness and Great One consciousness. The research hall is not trying to make monsters. It is trying to make mystics, in the most literal sense. People whose sight extends beyond the ordinary. That distinction does not help the patients. The physical suffering involved in growing something new inside your brain does not become less physical, because the goal is perceptual. The transformation that takes a person and enlarges their skull until it is unrecognizable does not become more dignified because the thing growing inside is an eye rather than a tumor. The choir's ambitions were genuinely elevated, in the sense that they were reaching towards something beyond ordinary human aspiration. The people they reached with were not elevated by the process, they were consumed by it. The choir intelligences, who appear in the upper cathedral ward and at the orphanage, are the choir's field agents. They carry celestial tools and work with the instruments of choir-level research. Their presence in those specific locations, rather than in the clinic or the lower church areas, confirms that the upper regions of the cathedral ward complex were the choir's operational territory. They are not healers or administrators, they are researchers who can also fight, which is the church's way of describing most of its upper tier. The orphanage's connection to the choir, established through the intelligences and through the architectural logic of the cathedral ward, means that the eye research and the orphan supply chain were connected operations. The children gathered there were candidates for both kinds of transformation, the celestial emissary track and the perceptual track. Some were probably destined for one and some for the other, selected based on whatever properties the choir's research had identified as predictive. The screening process that the orphanage performed was probably more sophisticated than anything you could infer from walking through the building. The choir also had a relationship with the healing church workshop that produced hunters, and that relationship was not entirely cooperative. The hunters were the church's weapons, tools for managing the beast plague. The choir wanted to use them as research subjects as well, which is suggested by the fact that some hunters ended up in the research hall rather than simply dying in the field. A hunter's blood, already changed by repeated ministration and combat exposure, was a different research substrate than civilian blood. And the choir was thorough. The communion rune, connected to the choir's practices and its relationship to blood echoes, suggests that the choir had developed a theory of how knowledge and experience could be transmitted through blood at a level that went beyond simple ministration. The runes themselves are a communication system that uses something like physical inscription to convey ideas that human language cannot contain. And the choir's fluency in the rune system was more advanced than the lower churches. Carol, who transcribed the runes, worked adjacent to but not inside the choir, which is why the runes are accessible to hunters, while the choir's deepest research remained internal. The choir's end state, as an institution, is visible in the upper cathedral ward at the time of the game's events. The organization has been largely consumed by its own research. The people who are conducting the experiments are either transformed, dead, or have become something that wanders the cathedral ward as an enemy type. The institution that set out to make contact with the Great Ones has made that contact in the sense that the research hall's subjects have, which is to say at the cost of what made the researchers researchers. The upper cathedral ward itself, with its ethereal quality and its celestial emissary enemies, and its access to the orphanage and the boss fight that culminates in Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, is the choir's achievement and its monument. Ebrietas is a great one who stayed behind when the others withdrew, who remained in contact with the choir's researchers, who is found still in the choir's chamber when you arrive. The fact that she is there, accessible, still present in the physical world, rather than retreating into nightmare or dream, is either the choir's greatest success or the reason the choir's research produced the results it did. Ebrietas does not look like a monster in the way that many Bloodborne bosses do. She looks like something that has been through something. Her design carries a quality of exhaustion or grief, an enormous being curled in a space that she has occupied for a long time, surrounded by the evidence of the organization that was meant to communicate with her and that instead became a collection of transformed bodies and wandering emissaries. She attacks you, but the fight has a different emotional texture than most boss fights in the game. The choir built everything it built to reach something like Ebrietas, and Ebrietas is still there, and the choir is not. Chapter 10. Ludwig and the Knights Who Burned Themselves Clean. Ludwig is one of the most significant figures in Bloodborne's history, who you encounter primarily as a monster. By the time you find him in the Nightmare of the Hunter, he has been there long enough that his transformation is complete. and the fight against him is one of the most kinetically overwhelming encounters in the game. An enormous horse beast thrashing in a space too small to contain it. All power and no coherence. The second phase is what makes the Ludwig fight unforgettable. When you reduce him to half health, he finds the Moonlight Greatsword, and something in finding it recalls him partially to himself. The music changes. He fights with grace that the first phase lacked. He speaks, finally, and what he says is the question that defines his character. Were we the hunters of beasts, or just beasts ourselves? That question is the thesis of Ludwig's existence, and the game gives it to you in a moment of clarity, surrounded on both sides by total horror. The clarity itself is as devastating as anything the game does, because you understand immediately that Ludwig has been wondering this for a long time. From inside a transformation he cannot reverse, and that finding a sword that connected him to his ideals gave him 30 seconds of coherence in which to ask it aloud. Ludwig founded the Church Hunter system. Before him, there were only Gehrman's hunters, the workshop's small band operating on the margins of a city that was already in trouble. Ludwig had a vision that was genuinely noble, or at least genuinely believed in. A formalized corps of hunters who would bring the sanctity of the Church's mission to the brutal work of beast control. The Church hunters wore armor. They used incantations. They framed what they did in the language of holy war rather than pest management. The Holy Moonlight Sword, which Ludwig's weapon echoes, was associated with the Church's purest aspirations. The moonlight itself, in Bloodborne's cosmology, carries properties connected to the Great Ones and to insight, and the sword that channels it was a symbol of the Church hunter's dual nature, both a weapon and a relic, both effective and meaningful. Ludwig wanted his hunters to be able to say that what they did was righteous, and he built the institution to support that claim. The problem was that the claim was harder to sustain the more you understood about the Church that authorized it. The Church hunters were more numerous and more organized than Gehrman's workshop hunters, which meant they killed more beasts and managed the plague more effectively. It also meant they had more exposure to the blood, more ministrations, more accumulated transformation over a shorter period. The efficiency of the institution was inseparable from the accelerated exposure to the very thing that was causing the plague they were fighting. Ludwig's own transformation is the clearest evidence of this. He is the founder and the idealist, and the most powerful hunter his organization produced. And he is a horse monster in the nightmare. The path from the man who asked about righteousness to the beast you find him as ran directly through the institution he built and the blood that institution required. He did not fail, despite the Church hunter system. He failed because of it. The Church knights who served under Ludwig took his theology seriously in ways that shaped their transformations. The bloodletting beast, encountered in the dungeons, is one of the more extreme examples of what Church hunter-level blood exposure produced. The beast carves its own chest open as a combat mechanic, which reads not as a random behavior, but as a continuation of something, a ritual self-examination, or a gesture toward the kind of blood sacrifice the Church's theology valorized. Continuing even through transformation, the powder kegs, the renegade faction of Church hunters who preferred explosive and unconventional weapons, are also Ludwig's legacy in a sideways sense. They disagreed with Ludwig's formalism and developed their own approach to beast hunting, one that was more destructive and less reverent. Their existence suggests that Ludwig's vision of the holy hunter was not universally accepted even within the institution he built, that some hunters found the theology a hindrance rather than a support, and stripped it away to get at the practical work underneath. The practical work underneath was always the same regardless of whether you framed it in religious language. You find beasts, you kill them, you take blood to do it. The theology was a way of giving that work meaning, and Ludwig needed it to have meaning in a way that Gehrman, who seemed to understand what the work cost without needing to elevate it, did not. That need for meaning is what the second phase of the fight is about. The sword gives Ludwig the meaning back for a moment, and he uses that moment to ask if it was ever real. The answer the game implies, through everything it has shown you by the time you reach Ludwig, is that the meaning was real, and that it did not change what the work was. The church hunters were holy, and they were also just doing what beasts do, because the blood they used to do it was making them beasts. Righteousness and transformation ran in parallel, and neither one cancelled the other out. Ludwig believed in what he was doing. Ludwig is what you find at the end of it. The nightmare preserves him in that state, which is its own cruelty. The hunter's nightmare is a space of repetition, of sins replayed, and Ludwig's presence there suggests that what he did constitutes one of those sins, that the church hunter institution, and whatever it participated in, was the kind of thing that generates a nightmare rather than simply being forgotten. He is not there because he was evil. He is there because what was done through him was the kind of thing that the cosmos does not simply absorb. When you defeat him, you can tell him that he was a hunter of beasts. His response to hearing it is relief. That response says everything the game wants to say about him. He needed to believe it enough that hearing it from someone standing over his dying body, after a fight in which he spent most of it as a creature without language or coherent thought, is a comfort. The belief was the whole thing. The reality was always secondary to it. Chapter 11. Yharnam the Pthumerian Queen, and what was kept underground. The deepest layer of the Chalice dungeons contains a woman whose name the game gives to the city built above her. Yharnam, the Pthumerian Queen of the Eye Hill Chalice, is the source of the name of everything you have been fighting through. The city is named for her, or named after what she represents. And understanding what she was and what was done to her, and what she carries, explains something about why the city's transformation has the specific character it has. Yharnam the Queen was a Pthumerian, one of the civilization that built the tunnels and studied the Great Ones and accumulated the old blood that the healing church would later harvest. As a queen of the Eye Hill bloodline, she sat at the top of the Pthumerian social structure in the deepest and oldest parts of the underground complex. The hill are described in the game's item texts as the oldest of the Pthumerian clans, the ones most deeply changed by Great One proximity, the ones who had been doing this the longest. What was done to Yharnam the Queen was specific. She was pregnant. She was pregnant with the child of a Great One, or something equivalent to it, in the way that such things happen in this world, through blood and exposure and the slow dissolution of the boundary between human biology and whatever the Great Ones are at a biological level. The child she carried was viable, or nearly viable, in the sense that it existed, and that its existence was significant enough that someone decided it needed to be contained. The healing church found her. The church scholars who went into the Pthumerian ruins encountered the queen and recognized what she represented: a living connection to the Great Ones, a woman whose blood was not just affected by the old blood, but was in some sense producing something new from it. She was exactly the research subject that the choir would later be trying to produce artificially through the research hall's experiments, and she existed naturally in the deepest dungeon. The church took her blood. This is stated in the item description for Yharnam's blood, which refers to the Queen of the Vile Bloods and makes the connection explicit. The church used the Queen's blood as a foundation for something it was building, a substance that carried properties no other blood had because of what the Queen was carrying. The extraction was not conducted with the Queen's consent. The dungeon's layout, with the Queen as a boss at its deepest level, suggests she was not accessible to the kind of persuasion that the imposter Yosifka used on survivors. The stillborn Great One that Ariana delivers in the main game is connected to this history through the blood. Ariana's blood is called Ariana's blood of Ariana in the item text, and it is described as belonging to a woman of pleasure from Cainhurst lineage. The Cainhurst connection, combined with the specific property her blood has, which causes the stillbirth, suggests that what the church took from the Pthumerian queen entered the blood supply in Yharnam in ways that eventually made Ariana capable of carrying what she carried. The queen in the dungeon fights without language, without the partial coherence that some of Bloodborne's bosses retain. She has been down there for a very long time, in whatever state the deepest dungeons maintain their occupants. The child she carried was never born, or was lost somehow, and what you fight is someone who has been in that state for longer than the church's existence. longer than Yharnam above has existed as a city. The city was named for her, or for what she represented, in a gesture that is either reverent or something darker. To name a place for the thing you harvested it from is a kind of acknowledgement, one that does not quite rise to guilt, but carries the shape of memory. Someone who helped build Yharnam above knew about the queen below and chose to use her name, and that choice is preserved in the city's name, even as the queen herself is preserved in the dungeon, accessible only to those willing to go deep enough. The connection between the Pthumerian queen and the vile blood queen, Annalise, is one of the game's more carefully obscured threads. Annalise draws blood dregs. Yharnam carried a great one's child, and the church's extraction of the deeper queen's blood contributed to the blood that eventually made its way into Cainhurst's lineage in transformed form. The two queens are separated by history and by the church's intermediary role, but they are part of the same project, one that started in the deepest dungeon and whose implications are still playing out in the surface world at the time of the game's events. The Eye Hill Chalice dungeon is the oldest and deepest place the game allows you to access. Going there means going through the full, layered history of the Pthumerian civilization and the church's exploitation of it, through all the intervening stages of the research and the transformation and the disaster, until you arrive at the woman whose name everything above carries. The descent is thematic as much as spatial. You are going to the source. What you find at the source is not an answer. The queen does not speak. She does not offer revelation. She is simply there, maintaining whatever state she has been in, for as long as she has been in it. And she fights you when you approach, and the fight ends the way all fights in Bloodborne end. The dungeon does not change when she dies. The city above does not change. Whatever she was the source of continues without her. The name persists, Yharnam. The city named for the woman the church found in its basement. The city that then did the same thing to everyone who came to it. The naming is a kind of signature, the first instance of a pattern that the entire game traces. Chapter 12. Simon the Harrowed and the Men Who Came After the Blood. Not everyone who came to Yharnam was there for the blood. Some came after the dream, after the myth of what Yharnam was had spread far enough to attract a different kind of visitor. People who were not sick and not desperate, but curious or ambitious, or simply called by something they did not fully understand. Simon the Harrowed is one of these visitors, and his story, told in fragments through the Old Hunters DLC, is one of the game's quietest and most human narratives. Simon came from outside Yharnam as a pilgrim of sorts, drawn by stories of what the city contained rather than by personal need. He is not a hunter in the traditional sense. He does not use the church's weapons or follow the church's methodology. He is an observer, someone who wanted to understand what Yharnam was and who has been trying to document it, and who has been largely failed by that project, because what Yharnam is cannot be adequately documented. His weapon is the Simon's Bowblade, a trick weapon that converts between a bow and a blade, which is unusual in the context of Yharnam's hunters, and which reflects something about who he was before he arrived. He is not from the school of thought that produced the church hunters, or even Gehrman's hunters. He brought his own approach, shaped by his own background, and in a city that had been shaped entirely by the church's theology and methods. That outside perspective is both his asset and his limitation. Simon knows things that other characters in the DLC do not know, or do not acknowledge knowing. He knows about Ludwig's fall, he knows about the research hall, and what happened to the patients there. He knows about the nightmare structure in ways that suggest he has been navigating it longer than most. His knowledge is not insider knowledge. It is the knowledge of someone who has been watching carefully from outside the system long enough to see the shapes that insiders cannot see, because they are too close to them. The tragedy of Simon is that the knowledge he has accumulated has not protected him. He is harrowed in the sense that he has been worn down, thinned, reduced by what he has witnessed. The information he carries is accurate, but it has not made him more capable of doing anything about what he knows. He is a witness without the power to intervene, which in Bloodborne's world is its own specific kind of horror. The game places him in a position where he can assist you by opening a door and providing information, which is a liminal role. He is neither enemy nor full ally. He is someone who has found a way to persist in the nightmare without either giving in to its logic or escaping it, which requires a specific kind of resignation that reads in his dialogue as exhaustion rather than peace. His final arc, if you follow it, ends in a way that confirms something the game has been implying throughout his appearances. That observation without action is not neutrality in Bloodborne's world, that being a witness to what happened in Yharnam. And the nightmare is not safe and not exempt from the costs that participation would have incurred. Simon ends up carrying those costs anyway, because the thing he was witnessing was not something that left observers unmarked. The hunters who came to Yharnam, for their own reasons, not born in the city, not recruited by the church, but arriving through the hunter dream or through the coaches that brought outsiders in, represent a category that the game treats with particular care. They are the frame through which you experience the world, and their outsider status is meaningful. The player character is one of them, the most recent arrival, the one who comes too late to prevent anything but perhaps early enough to affect how it ends. Simon, from that perspective, is a version of the player who arrived earlier and did not have the same capacity to act that the player character does. He gathered information. He understood the horror. He did not have the tools or the positioning to do what needed doing with that understanding. His story is a warning and a parallel, placed in the DLC, where you encounter it after you have already been through most of the main game's horrors, when you can recognize what he is describing and understand what his limits mean. The harrowed designation is not just an epithet. It describes a specific condition, one that is recognizable in Bloodborne's world, someone who has seen enough that the ordinary comforts of ignorance are no longer available, but who has not gained enough from the seeing to compensate for what it cost. Harrowed is what you become when insight gives you the perception without giving you the power. It is perhaps the most common outcome in Yharnam for everyone who tried to understand it. Chapter 13. Lawrence's Skull and the Memory of a Choice. There is an item in the cathedral ward that most players pick up and use for practical reasons without pausing on what it actually is. The skull of Lawrence is the remains of the man who founded the Healing Church, one of the pivotal figures in Bloodborne's entire history, and it functions in the game as a tool for accessing a memory sequence, in which you see a version of Lawrence before he became what he became. It is warm to the touch. The item description tells you this. It is warm because the memory it contains has not cooled. Lawrence was Gehrman's student before he was the church's founder. He attended the workshop. He learned to hunt. He understood what the old blood was before most people had ever heard of it. Because Gehrman and his circle had been living adjacent to the question of the Great Ones long enough to understand the costs that adjacent living incurred. Lawrence had this education, and then he built the Healing Church anyway. The memory you access with the skull shows you a version of Lawrence in the nightmare, still human-shaped, burning, not yet the cleric beast version of himself that you encounter in the Old Hunters DLC, but clearly in process, clearly partway through something that he started and cannot stop. The memory has a quality of preserved regret, a moment captured not at its worst, but at the point just before the worst, which is the point from which the worst is still visible as a choice rather than a fact. Lawrence as the cleric beast in the DLC is different from the cleric beast in the main game. The main game cleric beast is not identified. The DLC confirms that Lawrence is a cleric beast, that the founder of the church that manages the beast plague became a beast, that the man who built the institution to address the transformation underwent the transformation himself. This is either the most perfect irony in the game or the most inevitable conclusion, depending on how you read the relationship between the church's work and the church's ends. The skull is warm because Lawrence is remembering. The game's cosmology allows for memories to persist in blood and in bone, for the echoes of consciousness to remain in physical remains long after the person has been transformed or killed. The warmth is cognitive residue, the continued activity of something that was once a mind, and that is still, in some diminished and reduced form, thinking about what it did. What it is thinking about is suggested by the memory sequence. Lawrence was aware of the risk. He knew the old blood transformed people. He had Gehrman's education, and the evidence of the Pthumian ruins and whatever private research he had done in the years before the church's founding. He built the church anyway. He administered the blood anyway. He accepted the consequences of that choice as they manifested in the city and in himself, and he is still, in whatever cognition remains to a skull sitting warm in the cathedral ward, in the process of reckoning with that acceptance. The church he founded built a theology that explained why what he did was not a betrayal, the ascension framework, the idea that the transformation was progress rather than degradation, was partly a genuine belief and partly a structure for making the consequences of his choice survivable to the people who suffered them. If transformation was ascension, then what happened to the clinic's patients was elevation, not murder. If becoming closer to the great ones was the highest aspiration, then what happened to Yharnam's citizens over generations was at worst a rushed version of a good thing. Lawrence built that theology, and then he became the thing it was designed to justify, which is either the proof of his sincerity or the proof of its inadequacy. The cleric beast does not seem elevated. It does not seem like someone who successfully ascended. It seems like someone who has been eaten from the inside by what he believed in, which is a different thing, and which the skull's warmth preserves without resolution. The skull drops from his cleric beast form in the DLC. You take it from what he became and use it to access what he was. The path between those 2 points is the entire history of the healing church, compressed into the distance between a burning memory and a warm bone. Bloodborne builds these compressions constantly, placing its largest themes inside its smallest items, and Lawrence's skull is perhaps the most concentrated example of the game's method. The whole story, held in something you can carry, still warm with the thing it cannot forget. Chapter 14. The Lumen Flower Gardens and What the Patients Were Becoming. Above the research hall, past the elevator that takes you through the building's transformation from medical facility to experimental site, is the Lumen Flower Gardens. The name is gentle in a way that nothing in that part of the game earns. The gardens are where the research hall's patients who survived the farthest stages of the eye treatment were housed, or contained, or released into, depending on which word you think applies to what the choir did with subjects who had gone further than they were meant to go. The lumen flowers themselves are a botanical element in Bloodborne's world that appears in multiple locations, always in proximity to the church's research into the great ones and insight. The flowers seem to be connected to the same perceptual properties that the eye treatment was designed to cultivate, or they respond to the presence of whatever the treatment produces, or they are simply the church's aesthetic choice for spaces intended to evoke elevated perception. The exact relationship is not spelled out, but the consistent association means the flowers are not decorative. They are a signal. The patients in the lumen flower gardens are the ones the treatment got furthest in. Their heads are open in ways that suggest the transformation produced what it was intended to produce, something that allowed for perception beyond the ordinary. They wander the gardens with a quality that is not quite peace and not quite distress, something in between that reads as an altered state rather than suffering or contentment. They are perceiving something that you cannot see. Whether what they are perceiving is worth what the treatment cost them is not a question the game answers for you. The Lumen Flower Garden, as a space, is almost beautiful, in the way that Bloodborne's most disturbing places sometimes are. The flowers, the elevated position, the light quality, it was designed to be a place of completion, rather than a place of processing. The end of the research hall's pipeline, rather than another stage within it. Patients who reached the Lumen Flower Garden had, in the church's framework, arrived somewhere. They had become something. What they became is an enemy type that attacks you by broadcasting something at range, a visual effect associated with insight and perception, and the kind of sensory overload that the game uses to represent contact with great one-scale phenomena. They are still people in the sense that they have bodies, and they persist and they respond to their environment. They are not people in the sense that what is going on inside them has moved beyond anything you can communicate with through language or gesture. The connection to the winter lanterns, which appear in the Nightmare of Mensis, and are far more developed versions of what the research hall produces, runs through the lumen flower garden. The winter lanterns are the end point of a transformation that the research hall was moving toward, and the garden's patients are somewhere between the beginning and that end. The winter lanterns have fully developed the new perception, have become in some sense all perception, and have left behind whatever they used to be as people in the process. The garden patients are partway there. Whether the choir considered this a success depends on what the choir's actual goal was. If the goal was to produce beings capable of great one-level perception, then the winter lanterns are successful. If the goal was to produce beings capable of great one-level perception, who retained their human identity and could communicate what they perceived, then the process failed at the point where the identity was lost. The garden patients seemed to sit at the edge of that distinction, still humanoid, still present in a way the winter lanterns are not, but already beyond the reach of the kind of communication that would have made them useful as research partners rather than subjects.